Well, hello and welcome to the Northern Illawarra Uniting Church Sermon Podcast. Great to have you with us. Today we're going to be reading a lengthy story in Scripture, but I think you'll enjoy it. We're going to be reading selections from 1 Samuel, starting in chapter 17, verse 1. And it's a story. You'll probably recognize the story of David and Goliath. Would you read along with me? The words will be up on the screen. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, about 9 feet tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armored with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He stood and shouted out to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years, and David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Jesse said to his son David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. And also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of the 1,000. See how your brothers fare and bring some token from them." David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion of the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." His eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? It was only a question." He turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him as before. Then the words that David spoke were heard, and they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy he has been a warrior from his youth." And David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistines said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag and took out his stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. And so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. And there was no sword in David's hand. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. David and Goliath, the classic Sunday school story. We love this story. It's the best kind of story that we in our culture love to tell, the underdog beating the odds. I still remember when I was probably in year 3 on 1983, watching Australia beat America in that yachting race and winning the America's Cup for the first time in over 100 years. It was kind of a defining moment for our country. We saw ourselves as the underdog taking on the giant and winning. They called it back then a David and Goliath story. And this story has been told and retold so many times that it's been flattened down to a simple moral that the little guy always has a chance if he or she play their cards right. And we love these stories in movies and sport, whether it's Jamaican bobsled team or Star Wars. We love David and Goliath stories. But real conflict in real life is not like sport. There's no whistle at the end, no shaking of hands, walking off the field. And conflict in life is not like the movies because, to be honest, we don't always win. And even when the little guy does win, any conflict, violence is always traumatic and it always leaves a scar. Conflict is never simple. But this story actually is not about simple conflict. It teaches us a great deal about what real conflict looks like in your life and mine. So let's just get into it as we look at the story today. Let's talk about conflict. It's a real human problem that almost all of us face almost all the time. Most conflict happens not out there in the world, but close to home, in our homes, in our communities, amongst our neighbors, our families, and in our churches. Most conflict we experience happens between those who are closest to us. Heated arguments with our children, cold wars with our spouses, battles with our neighbors. Those moments tragically when violence erupts in the home, domestic violence, a huge source of conflict in our world today. Studies show that about a third of us are estranged, separated from at least one member of our family. Most commonly, it's parents with their grown-up children. We don't talk anymore is a refrain we hear over and over and over again. There's secrets and conflict in our families that just boils over or leads to a deep sense of disconnection. I read a story the other day that made me laugh quite a lot, not happily, but just because I recognized it so well. It's such a strange story, but reflects the nature of human conflict so clearly. It was about these two companies that maybe you've heard of. They were started in the 1920s, Germany. Two brothers named Rudolf and Adolf Dassler. They founded their own shoe company, and they called it the Dassler Brothers Shoe Factory. And though the two brothers didn't always see eye to eye, as brothers often don't, they were able to put their differences aside and work together, building a company that was quite successful. Now, they lived in Germany, and so as World War II broke out, they were trying to run their factory, but they had to climb into air raid shelters at night during bombing raids. Rudolph and his family were in a bomb shelter during an Allied bombing raid one night when Adolf and his family came into the room. And the first thing Adolf said as he entered was, "Here are the bloody bastards again." Referring, of course, to the bombers, the raiders who were bombing the city. But Rudolph, the other brother, assumed that Adolf meant him and his family, and no one could convince him otherwise. So from then on, their relationship just went from bad to worse over a misunderstanding. They refused to work together, and after the war, they dissolved their successful business, and each one started their own company. Maybe you recognize them. Adolf named his after himself. I mean, he couldn't call it Adolf after the war, so he named it after his nickname, Addy, and the first three letters of his surname, Adidas. Remember that one? Rudolph called his Ruda after his nickname, but eventually tweaked it to share a name with a fast-running animal, Puma. Two famous shoe companies, Adidas and Puma, born out of family conflict. Can you imagine, in the middle of World War II, in the middle of an air raid, hunkering down in a shelter as bombs blast overhead, getting into an argument with your brother or your sister, your parent, or your child? Well, of course you can. Because we've all done this, not maybe with an air raid, but we've all faced enormous challenges in our lives, real enemies, real conflict, real struggles. And there's evil to fight us in the world around us all the time. But most of the time, our real conflicts erupt between those who are closest to us. That's the dynamic that we see in the story today. Goliath, the enemy of Israel, is standing out in the valley of Elah. He is clearly the enemy. Every single day he comes out and tells the people of Israel, "I want to destroy your culture and enslave your people." If the giant wins, they would lose everything. Their culture would be destroyed, their worship, God's purposes in the world through his people would be decimated. Goliath is the real enemy, and the real enemy is clear. David recognizes it. He's not on the battlefield, but he's just delivering bread and cheese to his brothers. But as soon as he gets to the front lines, he sees Goliath standing out there bragging and rebuking Israel. And David is horrified. What's going on? This fool is insulting us. Someone needs to step up. How long, he says to the people around him, how long has this been going on for? And then there's this moment that if you have siblings, you recognize. David is talking out loud, frustrated with what's going on. And his eldest brother, Eliab, overhears him. He turns his anger and his frustration on to David. The language in the Hebrew suggests these nostrils flare up. He yells at David, "Why are you here? What happened to the sheep you've left behind?" he said to David. And then he gets really personal. He says, "I know this is just like you." You've heard those words in family conflict before. This is just like you. "I know your pride," he says. "I know the wickedness of your heart." Harsh words. He says, "You just came along to see a battle. You're bloodthirsty. You're proud. You're arrogant. You're presumptuous. You annoy me so much." Now, we understand this, but why does Eliab do this? Why does he attack David with such anger and viciousness? Why does he call David prideful and wicked? Why is he not angry and focused on the pride and the wickedness of Goliath? Instead of being angry at the Philistines, Eliab reserves his real anger for his little brother. Instead of facing the real enemy, Eliab is fighting with his family. It's the same dynamic that we saw with the Dassler brothers, and maybe we see in our own lives as well. There are many things we ought to be angry about in the world. There are enormous things that we ought to fight in the world. But most of our anger tends to be reserved for the people closest to us. We see it, parents trying to raise children in a world full of screens and sexualized imagery. We ought to be angry and fight against the companies and the cultures that create these systems that damage our kids, but instead we find ourselves mostly getting angry at them instead. We see it, I see it in struggling families, families that are short on resources, going through hard financial times. And instead of fighting against the oppressive economic systems that grind them down, they turn against each other. And you see it in families who are wealthy, who have enormous resources, who could do great good fighting against ignorance and poverty in the world. But the resources become a source of conflict between the members of the family, arguing who gets what. We see it in organizations that seek to do good in the world. We've seen this so often. Organizations, companies, non-profits that were started to make a difference in the world, to protect women and children, to work against poverty, to advocate for change. But these companies that should be fighting out there turn in on themselves with into-office politics and backstabbing. How many great causes have been undermined by political infighting? And of course, it's almost too obvious. But we see it in the church as well, don't we? Instead of speaking out against evil in our world, against the forces of darkness, churches become obsessed with tearing each other down. Petty differences divide us while we live in a world with slavery, ignorance, economic injustice, and spiritual darkness. Have you ever experienced that kind of thing? Instead of focusing on the real challenge, you find yourself sniping and bickering with others. Focus more on, say, internal church divisions than the great mission of the church. Why is that? Why do we exhaust ourselves with small conflicts when there are great and noble battles to be fought? Why is Eliab focused on David when we should be focused on Goliath? Let's be honest. The big battles against evil and injustice in our world, well, those are really scary. The big battles are the ones that we might lose. Goliath might win, or at least really, really hurt us. You see, none of the great battles that we're called to fight in this world, building a good family, building a strong marriage, fighting against poverty, bringing healing and peace to a divided world, none of these are easy battles. I know many of us have tried to fight those battles, and they're hard won. In fact, by definition, these battles are bigger than us or our own strength. And this is what I learned from David in this story. While his brother and presumably everybody else are turning on each other, David is laser focused on the real fight. Everyone else is blaming and shaming and shirking. No one else is focused on defeating Goliath, but in contrast, it's all that David is focused on. He seems shocked that people are allowing Goliath to speak another word. He wants to shut Goliath up. He wants to shut the Philistines down. David knows that someone must go and fight Goliath, and if nobody else will, he will. It simply must be done, he says, no matter how scary, no matter how impossible, this evil cannot stand. You see, the battles that really count are the ones that are really difficult. In fact, I might say that all the big battles are impossible. The battle for justice, the battle against evil and suffering, the battle for strong communities, the proclamation of the good news in a world that does not want to hear it. None of these are battles that we can win by ourselves. But we have to make a decision. Will we fight the important battles, even if they are the battles that we can't win? Martin Luther King Jr. knew all about fighting battles that seemed impossible to win, to fight for justice and for equality for his people. And in one of his speeches, Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1960s gave a speech to the American Psychological Association. And he used a wonderful word that I find myself coming back to again and again. Martin Luther King said he wanted to be maladjusted. He borrowed this word maladjusted from the world of psychology. Back then it was used quite a lot, not so much these days. But when people are mentally ill, they used to say that that person was maladjusted, out of sync with the world. And in psychology, Martin Luther King said, we want to be well adjusted. That's the goal, to be well adjusted as people. But he said, when I'm looking at the world and all its evil, all the injustice, Martin Luther King said that he wanted to be maladjusted. He wanted to be out of step, to never be at peace with the problems of this world. This is how he said it. We'll put it up on the screen. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation and discrimination. I never intend to become adjusted to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, leaving millions of people smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. Do you hear what MLK is saying there? He says he refuses to give up fighting the big battles, to be focused on the real evils in the world. Christians, of all people, should be maladjusted to the evils of this world. We, in Australia, should be maladjusted to rampant gambling, domestic violence, drug addiction, endless material acquisition, shallow anti-spirituality. We should be maladjusted to a church that is bitter and petty and fearful. The Bible says that our battle, the thing we ought to fight, is not flesh and blood. Our battle is against the powers and principalities, the great forces of evil of this present darkness. Friends, that's what we need to focus on. We ought to hate the causes of sin and death and of evil that oppress our children, our old people, our weak and the poor, and even oppress and entrap the wealthy and intelligent. We ought to take every thought captive for Christ and bring down every stronghold of imagination. We ought to be against evil in this world no matter what form it takes, and to protect everybody who's caught up in that evil. Now, even as I'm saying that, I know what we're feeling. It's scary. Those big enemies are terrifying, confusing, hard to see, hard to fight, impossible to beat. Perhaps as scary as a 9-foot Philistine with a bronze spear. Well, there's two things that David brings and teaches us with wisdom as he goes into this impossible battle. Firstly, David chooses the right weapons when he goes into battle. He picks up weapons. He doesn't pick up weapons that don't suit him. We didn't read this in this story because it was long enough already, but in the story, David goes to Saul and says, I'm going to fight Goliath. And so Saul gives him his armor, his heavy breastplate, his heavy helmet, his heavy shield, and David clanks around in it for a moment and just says, look, this armor doesn't fit me. This armor doesn't suit me. This armor won't work. It may fit the idea that the world has of winning battles, but it doesn't suit me. David says, just give me the weapons that I know, that are true to me. And so he takes up the weapons of a shepherd, the sling and 5 smooth stones. And David knows that God can work through these weapons as well as any other, perhaps even better. He doesn't use the weapons of Goliath. He uses the weapons that God has trained him in. David picks up the weapons that seem weak but were true to his calling. So my question is, what are the weapons that are true to our calling? What are the weapons that Christians ought to take up to fight these impossible battles? Well, our weapons, you know the answer, are love and prayer. These are the weapons that we must train ourselves in, that we must learn to pick up again and again. The weapons of this world, money, leverage, politics, even violence, these weapons don't suit the Christian. They ought to feel ill-fitting. The power of love and the power of prayer, well, these seem weak in the world, but they are the weapons which will help us win the impossible battles. This last week, there was a man who passed away, a man that some of us may have read his books, a man named Brother Andrew. Honestly, I read his books long ago. They were written in the 70s. To be honest, I thought he'd actually died a few years back, but it turned out he just died fairly recently. He was a missionary that became famous when he worked to smuggle books, Bibles, through the Iron Curtain. He wrote a famous book called God Smuggler. I remember vividly reading it when I was a kid. His book was very influential to me and to many others. But after, obviously, in the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he turned his attention to the Middle East, passionate still about bringing gospel truth to this place of conflict. And he helped Christians in Lebanon and Palestine and other places who were caught in the fight between Israel and Islam. And he sought to be an ambassador of Jesus Christ, even to those people that we today would have branded terrorists within the Islamic community, such as the leaders of Hamas and other Islamic nationalist groups. His mission was to see love as an alternative to military might. And he had the courage of his convictions. In 1992, members of the military group Hamas were expelled by Israel to South Lebanon, to a distant part of the country. And Brother Andrew saw these military people that many people called terrorists. He saw it as an opportunity to practice love. So instead of seeing how to bring weapons to kill them, he delivered tents and food and medicine. He says, and this is a quote from his book that he wrote later in life called Light Force. He says, "There are no terrorists, only people who need Jesus. As long as we see any person, Muslim, communist, terrorist, as an enemy, then the love of God cannot flow through us to reach him." Do you see what Brother Andrew was saying there? He says the enemy is not the person in front of us. It's the great systems of oppression and evil and deception. And the weapons with which we fight those things are prayer and love. And the weapons which we fight matter as much as the battles we choose to fight. And finally, the second thing that grounded David was the assurance that God is always on the side of the truth and of right. He's not on the side of the strong. God does not need to be on the side of the strong. God will always be on the side of what is right. God will have the final victory one day, sooner or later. And when we stand for what is right, when we stand against the powers that be in this world that are evil, then one day we'll be victorious. Sooner, but probably later. Because God is at work and God will always triumph. There's an old saying that was used by abolitionists back in the day. They said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. God will have his way. Love will win out. Evil will be destroyed. The Lord, as David says, does not save by sword or spear, but the battle always belongs to the Lord. Friends, our church has been at its best when we focus on the great enemies that face this world with the weapons of prayer and love. When we stop turning inwards and heresy checking one another and arguing amongst each other and picking who's the best Christian amongst us. No, the church does the best when we turn out and face the world and take on the battles that this world is afraid to fight, whether it's against slavery or segregation, or against economic injustice, or against prejudice, or against ignorance of the things of God. These are the things that we must fight, even though they're scary. Let's stop fighting amongst one another and turn our attention to the mission of God. After all, Jesus faced the closest around him, even his enemies, with nothing but prayer and love. And he faced the greatest enemies, not those who called him his enemy. He faced the greatest enemies, death, the grave, and the devil. And because Jesus triumphed, we will never be enslaved again. And we can take up our 5 smooth stones and our slingshot, as weak as they seem, and take on the greatest giants that this world has to offer with confidence and joy. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.